Hello, everyone, and welcome to Registrar Corp's webinar entitled U.S. FDA Drug Labeling Requirements. My name is Clay Blondin, a marketing specialist at Registrar Corp and today's moderator. The presentation will conclude with a live questions and answers session. If we run out of time, we are also happy to respond to your questions by email. You may submit a written question anytime during the webinar by using the Ask a Question feature in the top center of your webinar screen. A recorded copy of this presentation will be sent to all registrants. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Anna Benavente holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Mrs. Benavente has spent over 10 years of analytical research experience. As a senior regulatory specialist at Registrar Corp, she has been assisting companies with U.S. FDA regulations since 2009. She has researched thousands of products to determine whether they meet the FDA requirements for compliance. Mrs. Benavente is based at Registrar Corp's headquarters in Hampton, Virginia, where she manages a team of 15 regulatory specialists. I'd like to go ahead and begin. Anna?
Thank you, Clay, and good morning, and thank you for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to speak with everyone this morning regarding FDA's labeling regulations for over-the-counter drug products. Quick overview of what we'll be covering. We'll start off with a quick regulatory overview, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, with a bit about the formulation requirements that FDA has for over-the-counter drugs. From there, we'll move into general labeling requirements that cover most OTC drugs, and then specific information related to the drug facts panel. After that, we'll wrap up with the questions and answers, and as Clay mentioned, you're welcome to submit questions at any time. Okay, so to begin with our regulatory overview, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, it's important to know, is a federal agency under our Department of Health and Human Services. So they cover not only drugs, but cosmetics, most food products and beverages, dietary supplements, biologics, tobaccos, and medical devices as well. The authority for FDA is derived from our Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The reason why it's important to understand FDA's role in regulating drugs and the regulations that govern them is because of what happens upon entry. FDA expects all imported drug products to comply with the same rules as domestic products, and this includes labeling. So any product that comes into the United States is subject to examination at the time of entry. Particularly for new shippers or those that are shipping high-risk products, the chances of examination at the time of entry can be very high. If a drug is adulterated or misbranded, it can be detained upon entry into the United States. At that point in time, if it cannot be brought into compliance, the entry will be refused and must be destroyed or re-exported. For labeling, if you want to try and bring the product into compliance, relabeling import is possible. However, it's a very complicated process and may also result in changes to the drug listings that would have been submitted for that product. So it really is best to go ahead and have all of your requirements met prior to shipping. Companies with refused entries may be placed on what is called an import alert, whereby all future shipments of that product will be stopped and detained without any examination by FDA at all. When considering whether or not your product is going to be subject to the drug regulations, including labeling, registration, and listing, it's important to understand how FDA distinguishes between cosmetics and drugs so that you can know which set of regulations to follow. By definition, cosmetics are those that do cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. Drugs, however, are defined by our FDA Act as those intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, but also those that are intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. How FDA will decide if a product is a cosmetic or a drug can depend on the intended use. This intended use is a key factor in how FDA will regulate it. And so FDA will use a number of different factors, including product claims, consumer perception or a product's reputation, or the ingredients in a product. Products that are regulated as cosmetics should only claim to address superficial change, but not structural change. As noted in that drug definition, structural change, even if it's not in reference to a disease, can still cause a product to be regulated as a drug. And if a product has an intended use that falls under the definition of drug, it will likely be regulated as such, even if it doesn't contain an active pharmaceutical ingredient. So here's some general examples for cosmetics. For example, you've got shampoos, lipsticks, body washes. They all cleanse and beautify, but don't make any sort of structural or functional change to the body. Some examples for drugs. Hand sanitizers kill bacteria and can prevent disease this way, so they are regulated as drugs. Topical analgesics, such as the Tiger Rub, those will affect pain, arthritis, strains, bruises, sprains, and so because of this, they are affecting the structure and function of the body and therefore regulated as drugs. Some products do both, so FDA will regulate them under both the rubric for drug and cosmetic. So for example, a shampoo cleans, but if it treats dandruff, that causes FDA to regulate it as a drug. Sunscreen lipstick, same thing. The lipstick beautifies, but the sunscreen protects the body from UV rays and prevents sunscreen. Therefore, it's also regulated as a drug. Chapped lip balm, same thing, and as well as an anti-cavity toothpaste will also prevent cavities and therefore is regulated as a drug. So once you've determined whether or not your product is going to be regulated under the drug umbrella, you're going to want to check on your formulation requirements to make sure that it's appropriate under the FDA's drug requirements for over-the-counter drugs. So there are two primary pathways, and I reference these because they can have a direct impact on the labeling of your product. So the first pathway and the easiest pathway is through the drug's monograph system. And so FDA's recognition of an active ingredient as being generally recognized as safe and effective is the point of these monographs. So products that fall within the monograph are deemed safe for marketing with no further review by FDA. These monographs are published to describe the conditions of use and the acceptable active ingredients like a recipe book. They're published for many pharmaceutical categories and mean that a product does not have to receive an individual approval from FDA, provided it complies with the conditions described in that monograph. The other pathway is through the new drug application or the abbreviated new drug application process. So this is necessary when a product has a drug use for which there's no monograph, or it's necessary when a product has an active ingredient that's not covered by an applicable monograph. So for example, minoxidil, which is a hair growth active ingredient, there's no monograph for that particular active ingredient or intended use. So even though it's an over-the-counter drug, it's not treating any sort of serious condition, it still is required to go through the new drug application or abbreviated new drug application process, simply because there's no monograph to follow. The application process for these are lengthy and expensive. It involves generating supporting evidence and data, clinical trials, etc., to support the product being approved by FDA. It also requires a substantial fee be paid to FDA, anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 to $1 million or more. And it will result in FDA approval for that specific drug product. It's not a case where once it's approved for a specific drug that anyone can fall under that application. So it's important to understand that distinction between the new drug applications and the monograph systems. Again, with monographs, your exact product does not have to be approved by FDA, provided it conforms to the conditions of the monograph. Now with monographs, there's a timeline involved and it can usually be quite lengthy. FDA will initially publish what's called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to request data from industry to determine if active ingredients on the marketplace are generally recognized as safe and effective. Important to note that FDA does not generate its own data for all of these pharmacological products. They expect industry to have data and submit it for FDA to evaluate it for the GRASI status. Once received and reviewed, FDA will then issue a tentative final monograph that proposes what they call the monograph conditions for that particular type of drug product. FDA will then issue a final monograph to establish the conditions under which the OTC drugs can be marketed. So they'll talk about active ingredients, proper indications for use, labeling requirements, etc. So you'll want to determine which one yours will require. So it's necessary to determine if a monograph exists first and foremost. So for example, if you have a drug product for heartburn, FDA has established a final monograph for antacid drug products, which covers this particular intended use. So that's a good thing. Then you have to take a look at your active ingredient. So for example, if calcium carbonate is your active ingredient, it is covered under the monograph at certain concentrations. So then you're good to go. There's no further requirements in terms of submissions to FDA or anything like that. You'll just need to make sure that you're marketing the product under the conditions of the monograph. However, if you have omeprazole, that's not covered by the monograph. It's considered a new drug. And so therefore it will require the new drug application or the abbreviated new drug application be submitted to FDA, and your product will require specific approval from the agency. A vast majority of the products on the marketplace are covered under monographs. And so this is a list of examples of monograph conditions that have been described by FDA. So for example, acne cleansers, cough and cold products, antiperspirants, sunscreens, lip balms, everything you see on this list may be covered by a monograph, provided your active ingredient is included. And as we noted on the previous slide, if your active ingredient's not included in the monograph, you'll need to do the NDA or the ANDA or reformulate to include an active ingredient that is covered under the monograph. Then we'll move on to the general labeling requirements. I must preface this by saying that it's important to understand that there are a lot of drug regulations. So what I've tried to do is pull together the general labeling requirements, but please note that there's a labyrinth of regulations throughout the Code of Federal Regulations. And so you'll want to make sure that you've done your research to ensure that there are no additional specific requirements for your exact drug product. But these are the general labeling requirements. We have what we call our statement of identity. You'll be declaring the net quantity of contents. You'll also be declaring the manufacturer, distributor, or packer. Importantly, you must include a domestic U.S. phone number or mailing address for adverse event reporting. We've actually seen a fair number of detentions recently where this requirement is cited, so it's important to know that it must be there. Lot numbers and expiration dates must also be included in many cases, as well as the Tamper evidence statement. And of course, our ubiquitous drug facts panel is going to be part of the labeling for most over-the-counter drugs. Now, the content requirements, and this is why we kind of went over that monograph system, albeit briefly. It's important to know about the monograph system because the monograph may dictate many of the mandatory statements that have to be included in the labeling. For drugs that are marketed under an NDA or an ANDA, the content for much of the labeling is going to be determined during the application process as FDA evaluates the safety data and the effectiveness data that the company submits to determine what sort of labeling statements are required to ensure that consumers can use it safely and effectively. Again, the general labeling requirements will apply no matter whether you've got a monograph drug or an NDA drug. Now, for the monograph-specific content, monographs will often dictate that mandatory statements for the statement of identity, for the purpose and the pharmacological action of the drug, the indications for use that can be declared for that particular drug product, warnings and directions necessary for safe use, and monographs can also dictate what other sorts of allowable statements may be made, and they can also state what definitively cannot be claimed for that particular type of drug product. Now, drugs that are marketed under a final monograph will have the content codified in Title 21 of our Code of Federal Regulations. However, drugs that are being marketed while still in the tentative final monograph stage will have content dictated in the Federal Register notices that proposed the monograph conditions. The Federal Register is sort of the daily newspaper for the U.S. government, and it's where all the federal agencies will propose rules, including drug monographs. So first and foremost, your statement of identity is going to have to include the established name of the drug if one has been established. It will also include the general pharmacological category or categories or the principal intended action of the product. If you have a mixture of drugs with no established name for the mixture, then you can satisfy the requirement with a prominent display of just the pharmacological categories or principal intended actions. Now, these, again, going to be stipulated a lot of times in the monographs, and so you want to certainly reference the monograph when determining the statement of identity for your product. Now, this statement must be placed on the principal display panel, which is the panel that usually faces the consumer when it's on a retail shelf. It should be in boldface type and parallel to the base of the package. FDA also stipulates that it must be in a type size reasonably related to the most prominent text on the label. Unfortunately, FDA doesn't tell you what they think reasonably related means. So the only thing we have to go off of is in the food labeling guide. FDA says that it's half the size of the largest text on the label. So we generally tend to try and present statements of identity in that size, but please note that in terms of drug products, FDA hasn't defined what they mean by reasonably related. So you just want to make sure that it's distinct at a minimum. The net quantity of contents is also going to be declared on that PDP. Depending on the nature of the drug and the dosage form, you might be using units of measure, either solid measure such as gram and ounce, liquid measure, numerical count for a number of tablets, unit strength, or even linear measure or area, depending on your drug. It has to include both the avoirdupois and the metric measure when applicable, and needs to be in the bottom 30% of that PDP. The type size of the statement is going to be based on the area of the PDP. FDA has 5 different sizes that increase in size depending on the size of that PDP. So you want to carefully ensure that you've got the minimum type size covered for this net quantity statement. Next up, we're going to make sure that that manufacturer, packer, or distributor is declared. FDA gives you the option of declaring any one of those 3. So certainly companies have the flexibility to choose which is most appropriate for that particular product and that particular label. Now, it must include the actual corporate name. A DBA will not cover it. Abbreviations that do not constitute the actual corporate name will not cover it. So please ensure that the actual corporate name is declared, as well as a full address, no PO boxes. And so you want to ensure that it's a complete address so that FDA has reasonable assurance that they can contact the manufacturer, packer, or distributor if necessary. If the entity that's declared is not the manufacturer, then you have to have a descriptive phrase that will make this clear. So you would want to include distributed by, packed by, manufactured for, whatever is deemed most appropriate for that company that's named. Also, the street address can be omitted if it is found in a current city directory or telephone directory, but please ensure that the rest of the address is still complete. An additional requirement is that the Labeling include a U.S. mailing address or phone number. It needs to be a domestic U.S. phone number, including the area code, or a full mailing address. In this case, P.O. boxes will meet this requirement. Although if you use a P.O. box, please ensure that you still have the full street address present on the label as well. The purpose of this is to provide an address or phone number to which a consumer can report a serious adverse event. So the address or phone number must lead to a quote-unquote responsible person who then must turn around and submit a report of the event to FDA within 15 business days of receipt. The law only requires that the address or phone number be present, but FDA does recommend a clear statement be included, such as to report a serious adverse event, contact, and then followed by that contact information. Drug labels and packaging should include lot numbers, which is defined as any distinctive combination of letters, numbers, or symbols, or any combination of them, from which the complete history of the manufacturer, processing, packing, holding, and distribution of the batch or lot can be determined. So in essence, you need to have this traceability through the lot number so that if there's a problem with a particular product, it can be traced back and corrective actions made. An incorrect lot number can cause a drug to be deemed misbranded and therefore in violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Expiration dating is going to be present on a fair number of products. Now, this date must ensure that the drug meets the applicable standards of identity, strength, quality, and purity at the time it's being used by a consumer. So it should be determined by appropriate stability testing. FDA has the requirements for stability testing outlined in 21 CFR 211-166 for those who are interested. Generally, it has to appear on both the immediate package and the outer container. FDA recognizes most of us, including myself, tend to throw away outer containers after we've purchased the product and started using it. So they want to ensure that it's on the immediate package as well. Drugs that have no dosage limitations, though, that are stable for 3 years, according to that stability testing, are exempt from the expiration dating. So, for example, a sunscreen has no dosage limitations, and if it's stable for 3 years, you don't have to worry about the expiration date, although many companies still select to voluntarily include an expiration date. Tamper evidence statements, of course, are a very important part of many drug product labels, and they're required for all drugs except for dermatological, dentifrice, insulin, or lozenge products. So this requirement means that the package itself must be tamper resistant, and the label must alert consumers to the specific tamper evident features in a prominent place. The statement must be in a situation where it won't be affected if the package is actually breached. And the statement should include the characteristics of the features. So for example, you might put prominently on the principal display panel something to the effect of, do not use if, seal around the bottle cap is breached or missing, something to that effect. You can also include this statement in the other information section of the drug facts panel that we'll get to a little bit later in the presentation. And here we are, the drug facts panel, which is the most complicated part of drug labeling, and one that there seems to always be a lot of questions about because it can be very convoluted. So FDA has quite a few requirements related to the drug facts panel. The formatting of the drug facts panel came about in 1999 when FDA issued a final rule that mandated specific formatting and sections to the drug facts panel. And so prior to this, they had content requirements, but had not really specified how that information should be presented. So the intent of this final rule was to ensure that the readability and clarity of the drug facts information was presented in a way so that consumers could know how to safely and effectively use the product. The content of this drug facts panel is dictated by that monograph or FDA approval and describes the exact statements that are required by FDA. You should not change these it's just a bad idea. This is how FDA determined that the information that consumers would need, and so it should be included verbatim in the drug facts panel. Now, additional warnings and statements may be required by other regulations, so know that you can't rely solely on the monograph itself. You have to research all of the drug labeling regulations to ensure that all of your requirements are being met. So this is the general template that FDA gave in their final rule from the Federal Register. Please do note, though, that your drug may not necessarily have all of these sections, particularly the warnings section. So, for example, you can see all of those subsections underneath the warnings. Some products may have those, some products may not. It all boils down to what sorts of warnings are necessary for safe use of the product. Now, the mandatory sections and headings, though, will be the active ingredient, where you will have to include the established name of the drug, as well as the quantitative amount per unit, such as per tablet, or if you have a topical product, such as a hand sanitizer, you may be using the percentage by weight for that particular active ingredient. Then you're going to include the purpose statement. So this will be the general pharmacological categories or principal intended action of the active ingredient. It must be identical to that which was declared in your statement of identity. And generally speaking, it's going to also be specified in the monograph. Following the purpose, you'll have your uses, which will be the indications for use as permitted by the monograph or the NDA, ANDA approval. The next section that you'll be including will be the warning section. Now, FDA has established specific subheadings in that final rule for certain monograph and approval-specific warning. So, for example, you'll see these repeated throughout drug facts panels throughout the U.S. marketplace, and these are part of the final rule and must be used. So, for example, you can see you've got do not use, which is a subheading for contraindications, stop use and ask a doctor if, for a consumer to know for signs of toxicity or other sorts of adverse reactions to the drug, and so forth. You're also going to have other warnings elsewhere in regulation that's important to be aware of, such as keep out of reach of children is required for all drug products with very few exceptions, and has to be followed by an applicable accidental overdose or ingestion warning. This is going to be based on usually on whether the product is either oral ingestion, whether it's topically used, or if it has rectal or vaginal use. Also, for external use only will be required for some and many topical drugs. Pregnancy and breastfeeding warnings are described in the CFR for drugs intended for systemic absorption. Then you'll have other very product-specific warnings, such as flammability warnings, choking hazards, liver warnings for acetaminophen, this sort of thing. Following the warning section, you'll have the directions section. And so the directions for use are described, just like everything else, it seems, in the applicable monograph or the NDA, ANDA approval. Typically, they're going to be in bulleted statements or a table format. Important to know, it has to be in table format when there are 3 or more age groups specified. So, for example, think of your cough and cold medicines. You'll have different dosage forms, usually for children 2 to 6, 6 to 12, and then 12 and up. And so those are going to be in a table format to ensure that a consumer can easily determine the proper dosing depending on the age of themselves or their child. And these directions should also reference the dosage unit, such as a tablet or capsule, rather than the quantitative amount of the drug, such as 200 milligrams. Other information is, generally speaking, going to be next. I include this in the mandatory sections because for certain monographs, there is a mandatory section for other information, but it may not be necessarily used in every single type of drug product. This section is sort of a catch-all section. It's for information that's mandated or made optional by a monograph, and that's not appropriate for any of the other sections. So, for example, tamper evident or storage statements can be placed here. Sunscreens, for example, have a mandatory statement about storage that goes in this section. Other drugs, particularly the oral, those that are orally consumed that contain sodium and potassium, calcium and magnesium, in certain cases you have to declare that content, and so those statements may go in the other information section, things like the aspartame warning for phenylalanine and so forth. Lastly, you're going to have your inactive ingredients declared. So these are going to be your flavors, colors, carriers, things like that, anything that's not an active ingredient, and will be declared by its established name. Products that are straightforward drugs, list them alphabetically. However, if you have a drug-cosmetic product, such as makeup with the sunscreen, you're going to list them in the manner of cosmetics, which is usually in descending order by weight. However, you do have some exemptions under the cosmetic labeling rules that drug cosmetic products are allowed to also use, such as using a may contain statement for color additives. Lastly, we've got a voluntary section for questions that can be used if desired. Again, it's optional, but if it's present, it has to include a telephone number. It's not appropriate to use it and simply put in an email address or a website. It may include additional numbers for support in other languages if appropriate. And then FDA also recommends inclusion of the times and days that a person is available to answer questions. Now, the format of the drug facts box also kind of convoluted, just like the content, and so it's difficult to get it right unless you've really pored over the regulations. A product that doesn't have a properly formatted drug facts panel can run into problems upon entry into port because the labeling is considered very important to ensure safe use of the product. So it's important to make sure that your drug facts panels are properly formatted and that the content is correct. It should be set off in a box. It should have the drug facts title. And then it should also include drug facts continued when there are additional columns present to incorporate all of the content. Bar lines are used to separate each heading. And then you're going to also use hairlines under the title and certain subheadings in the warning section. To ease readability, FDA requires that bullets be used when there's more than one statement under a heading or a subheading. There are also requirements in how bulleted statements have to be presented in order to have them lined up, again, for the ease of readability. There are also minimum type size and bullet sizes. For example, your bullets are supposed to be 5 points. They should be a circle or a square. Boldface type is required for certain statements. And there are very strict rules regarding things like left versus right justification, how those bullets are aligned, certainly the order of the statements, as well as what's called leading around the statement, which is graphic designer's way of saying how much space is around all of those statements. There are a couple of different types of formats. So there's standard format, but it can be modified in certain ways. So FDA, for example, allows use of more than one column, either on the same panel of the package or on adjacent panels. So you can see here an example of the column format. You can see this is on the same panel, so they're adjacent to each other. You'll note that there's a little arrow in the bottom right corner that directs the reader to the next panel to ensure that they have complete information about the product. In the case where you have maybe a long skinny box, where the drug facts is going to appear, you can have that second column appear on the next panel. It should be the panel that is immediately adjacent to the first panel, however. So you would not want to have blank panels in between your drug facts chart. There should be a continuous flow of information so that that consumer has access to all the information at once. Certain packages that are smaller and have lots of drug facts information can run into a space problem. So FDA does allow for modified versions of the drug facts panel when a standard version requires 60% or more of the package surface area. So this modified format allows for smaller type and bullet sizes and also some modifications to the format requirements. So you see here an example of that modified format. You'll notice, however, though, that not all of the bullets are lined up with each other. You'll notice there isn't a box per se around the entire drug facts chart. The arrow, though, you will notice is still there, leading from one panel to the next. So these are the modifications that FDA allows for the smaller package sizes. So that concludes the general information that we're presenting. Of course, we will be taking questions as well. Just a quick recap, though, Registrar Corp does offer services for drug clients that include label review and graphic revision. If you don't want to bother with all of the hassle of the drug facts panel, then we are happy to do it for you. And so we've done hundreds of drug labels and have figured out all of the issues that can impact, what labeling needs to be incorporated into a drug facts panel, as well as the other required labeling declarations. So we're happy to help. We also can help with the other requirements for drug products, such as registrations and listings, the now mandatory annual registration renewal that FDA has instituted, and also help you with any registration updates that you might have. If you've run into a problem with a drug product, we have people at the ready to help with any sort of detention issues. Quite possibly, we can help you resolve the issue so that the product won't be refused entry. And then we can also help with DUNS numbers and assistance in obtaining those so that the registrations can be submitted as well.
Thank you, Anna, for that great presentation. Again, I'd like to announce that we will be sending a recorded copy of this webinar and a PDF copy of the presentation to all registrants. You may submit a written question anytime now by using the Ask a Question feature in the top center of your webinar screen. All right, first question. How do I find the proper monographs for my product?
Okay, thank you. Excellent question. The FDA has what's called the Status of OTC Rulemaking page. And what it is a page that summarizes all of the Federal Register notices and rules that have been published by FDA for all of the different pharmacological categories. So that's usually the first place where people will go. It's important to ensure that you have the entire timeline. For example, external analgesics. They're still in a tentative final monograph phase. If you have something like hydrocortisone, initially hydrocortisone was considered GRAS-E up to 0.5%, if I remember correctly. Later published Federal Register notices, however, increased that up to 1%. So if you went to just the tentative final monograph, you might think that 0.5% was your upper limit, but it actually was later raised to 1%. So the Status of OTC Rulemaking is your first stop in determining what is the totality of the rules that are going to impact your drug product.
Okay. Next question. Which part of the CFR has the drug regulations?
So you may have noticed the citations in 201 that were sprinkled throughout my presentation. 201 is sort of the general landing area for drug regulations. That's where a lot of the labeling requirements are. However, there are additional requirements in other sections of the CFR. Generally speaking, in the 300s, you'll find product-specific requirements for all of the different drug categories. So the final monographs, when they're codified, tend to be in the 300s. So for example, first aid antibiotics and the antifungal and acne drug products are in 333. The cough and cold final monograph information can be found in 340, and there's some general requirements in 330.
Okay. I would like to use your services for product label review for drug products. Can you tell me how the process works?
Certainly, thank you for asking. The way that we organize the process is we ask for the labeling that currently accompanies the product. We're going to use that information to determine the pharmacological category of the drug. We're going to look at the intended uses to see which monograph the intended uses will correspond to. Then we'll look at the active ingredient to see whether or not it's in conformance with the monograph. At that point in time, if the product is in conformance with the monograph, then we'll go ahead and proceed with the label revision. We'll review all of the drug regulations that may affect your product. We'll draft and revise the label so that it includes a properly formatted drug facts chart with all the mandatory content, make sure that all the other information that's required is present, and ensure that we give you back a revised graphic that can be used immediately to ship your product to the United States. If your product is subject to a monograph but doesn't have an active ingredient, what we'll do at that point is advise you the types of ingredients that are permitted under the monograph so that it's maybe possible to reformulate the product so that it's in conformance with the monograph. Once that part is done, then we proceed with the label revision, just as in the other case. Because there are also registration and listing requirements, if that process hasn't been completed by your firm and you're interested in our services for registration and listing, then we also work hand in hand with the registration and listing group at Registrar Corp, and we'll make sure that we have a seamless transition for your company into FDA system so that your labeling is perfect and your registration and listing is all squared away and you can ship without incident.
If the inner label of my product is very small, should we bear a warning to maintain the outer carton?
This is an excellent question and certainly a situation that a lot of people run into. So in the final rule for the drug facts panel from 1999, FDA acknowledges that inner containers often cases don't have the space necessary to incorporate a full drug facts panel. So what they do is they recommend that companies try and add the drug facts panel to the inner container. In cases where the inner container is simply too small for all that information, what we usually recommend is that the inner container include a statement such as you describe, explaining to the consumer that the outer container has the complete drug facts information. Adding a statement that they should maintain the outer container actually is a really good idea and a good plan. For the inner container, we recommend that it include the active ingredients, warnings and directions, as well as that number or address to report a serious adverse event. Our rationale being if they actually have a serious adverse event, the important information would be the active ingredients and that contact information. And then, of course, warnings and directions are going to help them ensure safe use of the product.
Okay, excellent. Next question. Can I use a toll-free number for the adverse event reporting?
So FDA issued guidance related to the adverse event reporting requirement, and in it they do reference a toll-free number. And so it would appear appropriate to use a toll-free number. The rationale being that the U.S. mailing address or local or U.S. phone number, including toll-free numbers, make it easy for a U.S. consumer to then report that event versus having to call overseas or something like that.
Okay. Next question. Can I add cosmetic claims such as moisturizing to the uses section of the drug facts panel?
It's very important that companies not add cosmetic uses into the drug facts uses section. Now, that type of information can certainly be declared elsewhere on the label. So, for example, if you have a sunscreen face powder that beautifies, you can make claims about it outside the drug facts panel. But the information within the drug facts panel should only be those statements that are required or allowed under the monograph. The idea being that the safe and effective use of it for the drug purposes is the entire intent behind that drug facts panel. And it shouldn't be distracted from by claims about moisturizing or beautifying or things like that.
Okay. Do homeopathic drugs have to follow this format?
Okay, so good question. The homeopathic drugs are actually exempted from this format in that final rule. However, if you look on the US marketplace, many of them do actually go ahead and use it. FDA hasn't really said one way or the other how they feel about that. So it's really left to the homeopathic practitioners' own counsel as to whether or not they should use the drug facts panel. Many homeopathic remedies are in bottles that are so tiny that they would never in a million years fit a drug facts panel. However, some of the other products that are being marketed, and we actually have clients who have homeopathic drugs who want to use that drug facts panel so they can ensure that all the necessary information that they've deemed required for their product is presented in a clear manner.
Okay, next question. Can I just copy a similar product's labeling?
So it's always very tempting to just copy either a competitor's label or another product that you find on the internet or on Amazon. But it's important to know that even when a product is submitted to FDA as part of a drug listing, FDA is not reviewing that product labeling for compliance. In fact, if you look at the Daily Med repository of all the publicly available drug product listings that have the labels, there's actually a disclaimer at the top that says that FDA has not reviewed it for compliance. So it's risky to just copy another product's labeling because you don't know for sure whether or not it's in compliance and that labeler knows what they're doing. And if you run into a problem, you certainly can't point to another product and say, well, but he did it too. FDA inspectors are notoriously unsympathetic to that type of argument. So you'll want to do your own homework, your own research to make sure that the labeling is appropriate. Another reason too is that different active ingredients can have different requirements for labeling, even if they're covered by the same monograph. So for example, in the external analgesic monograph, the warnings for menthol and the directions for menthol are actually different than those for methyl salicylate because of the possibility of oral ingestion of methyl salicylate by a child or an infant. There's different directions, different age ranges for methyl salicylate, and you wouldn't necessarily know that if you hadn't actually done your research. So if you had a product with methyl salicylate, you would not want to copy the drug facts panel from a product with menthol.
Okay, next question. Can a peel back label be used on small packaging?
The short answer to this is yes, and it's actually very, very common, particularly on products where the drug facts information is quite lengthy. So for example, cough and cold products have drug facts panels that are a mile long. And so oftentimes, particularly if they're not packaged in outer boxes, they may use a peel back label. Small containers of hand sanitizer, you'll see the same thing. And so FDA recognizes that this is necessary, and they do not seem to have a problem with it. The one thing to know, though, is if you are putting your Tamper evidence statement in the other information section of your drug facts panel, you have to make sure that it's still visible from the outside of that peel back label. Because FDA has stated that they want to make sure that a consumer just picking up and looking at the product will be able to see the tamper evidence statement. They don't want the consumer to have to peel it away in order to see it and risk them not doing so and then accidentally ingesting an unsafe or tampered product.
Okay, we will now take our last question. What if my product is covered by more than one monograph?
So certain products will actually be covered by more than one monograph. For example, the cough and cold products actually have a number of different monographs because it covers antitussive, nasal decongestant, expectorant, and so forth. So if you've got a product that is covered under more than one monograph, you'll want to make sure that you review both sets and then synthesize the information into a single drug facts chart, which can sometimes be kind of challenging. FDA will allow you, though, to eliminate duplicate warnings if need be, or combine them so long as the intent of it is still clear and the readability still remains high.
All right, we are out of time, but you can send us additional questions anytime by email to info@registrarcorp.com. This concludes our presentation, and thank you for joining us today.